Okay, so it's just gone 6 o'clock and we'll get going. Good evening, everyone. My name is Esther Wagner. I'm the Executive Director of the Woolf Institute, and I'm also the Editor-in-Chief of Almazak, the Journal of the Medieval Mediterranean. It's the journal of the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean, who is organizing this webinar series together with the Woolf Institute. And thank you very much for joining us this evening in this series that we're organizing together with partners at the CSIC IMF, the University of Munich, and the Medieval Studies Research Group at the University of Lincoln. So for those of you, I see from the names, quite a few of you are regulars in our webinar series, but for those who haven't been before, the Woolf Institute, which is hosting us, is a research institution in Cambridge. We focus on religion and society, and we combine our research with teaching, with public education, and with policy work. So, and now I'm putting on my hat as Vice President of the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean. The Society for the Medieval Mediterranean was founded in 1997 and is dedicated to all aspects of the academic study of cross-cultural Mediterranean history from the 5th to the 15th century. And this is also, again, a moment to point out that this beautiful journal that is in my hands is part of the subscription that comes with the membership of the Society. So please have a look at our website and consider joining the Society, which means that you will get this amazing green journal that comes out every 4 months. So a very quick introduction of how this webinar works. We have a Zoom webinar audience, and we also are live streaming via Facebook. So if you want to rewatch this, or if you want to recommend it to anyone to watch, it's available from Facebook after this webinar finishes, and also will be put up on our YouTube channel, the Woolf Institute, and the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean websites very, very shortly. So our topic for today is Jewish women, Conversas, and Christian women in Medieval Catalonia, agency and economic resources. And I'm going to introduce your chair for tonight, Dr. Antonella Scorpo, who in turn will introduce the speakers for this evening. And the panelists will present on the topic, short presentations, and then have a short discussion among themselves, while you can prepare questions for the Q&A session, which we will then have afterwards. And please type the questions you have in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens, because it's much, much easier for us to handle the questions there. And so it's my immense pleasure now to hand over to Antonella. Antonella, please take over.
Hello, thank you, Miriam, and welcome everyone. It's so lovely to see from your names there are lots of colleagues and students in our virtual room today. And thank you to our speakers who have joined us today, despite, as we were saying, a very long and intense term, to conclude this first part of our series, at least before Christmas. We will be back from January. So I'm going to introduce all the speakers now, and then we can move on to their presentations. And in order of appearance, we will start with Dr. Anna Richabad, who's an assistant professor at the University of Nottingham, in the UK. She got her PhD in medieval history at the University of Barcelona, and she's the author of the Jewish community of Barcelona between 1384 and 1391 through notarial records, as well as a long list of other publications in both Catalan and English. And her research mostly focused on the development of trade and artisanal activities among Jews in Barcelona, and in particular on female participation in the life of their communities. Then we'll hear from two speakers who have prepared their research together, and I'll explain in a moment why. Alexandra Guerson, who's an assistant professor at the University of Toronto, New College in Toronto. She got her PhD from the University of Toronto, where she worked on a thesis on coping with crisis, Christian-Jewish relations in Catalonia and Aragon between 1380 and 1391. And she will give her presentation with Dana Wessell-Lightfoot, who's an associate professor of history at the University of Northern British Columbia in Canada. She's the author of a monograph entitled Women, Dowries and Agency, Marriage in 15th Century Valencia. And Alexandra and Dana work together, and their current project is actually a collaborative research project on Jewish women and Conversas in late medieval Catalonia. This project is funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and they've actually recently won the Society for the Study of Early Modern Women and Gender Award for Best Collaborative Project of 2020, and also for the book essay Women and Community in Medieval and Early Modern Iberia that was co-edited with Michelle Armstrong Partida and published by the University of Nebraska Press. And last but not least, our final speaker for today will be Mireia Comas, who's a lecturer in medieval history at the University of Barcelona. And she's also published extensively on, in particular, widowhood and women's writing in the Middle Ages. And among her study, there's also one of her books published with Biella in 1215. Her current research focuses on actually aging and elderly people in Catalonia between the 13th and the 15th century, which sounds like another interesting topic, maybe for another webinar. So I'll pause here and leave the floor for our first speaker, Anna.
Okay. So good evening, everyone, and many thanks to the organizers, to Antonella, to Miriam, and everyone involved in making this seminar series possible and for inviting me to it. I'm gonna share my screen. So this is my slides for tonight, and in this presentation, I would like to focus on the question of economic agency of Jewish women in Barcelona in the second half of the 14th century. And I am interested and been researching for a while in the different ways in which these women could control their assets, their inheritances, their dowries, and how they could or not increase their wealth through financial investments and through their labor. And I am particularly interested in seeing how they interacted with their male relatives in the economic/domestic sphere, and how far they could go from this enclosed context into the communal economic life, or even beyond the limits of the Jewish quarter. And I am also interested in seeing how different are Jewish women in Barcelona from Christian women, and how different or similar are their experiences of agency. And today I would like to present 3 case studies of female economic activities in money lending and in the world of artisans that I think may serve well for this comparison. So next slide is my first case study, who is Blanca, the widow of Mosè Bonsenyor, and she is a widow of a member of the elite family Gracia, who had held important positions in the leadership of the Jewish community of Barcelona. Mosè Bonsenyor died sometime around 1348, maybe during the outbreak of the Black Death. And also his son, who was taking over the business of the family in money lending, died in the same period of time. And that left not many in the family to carry on with financial activities. So Blanca appears as a very active money lender, particularly in the year of 1351, when she figured in no less than 35 loan contracts. And some of these are legacies from her husband's business and her son's, but mostly they are new contracts of loans that she established with farmers in the surrounding area of Barcelona. So you can see in the right-hand side the network of the loans contracts that she established on that year, and you can see it's quite extensive and there are a lot of ramifications. And the other thing that you can see is that some of these interactions are with other widows in the same family. So I don't know if you can see my cursor, but here there is Regina, who is her daughter-in-law, and she also acts in other years and in other contracts with her sister-in-law, Vidala. It seems that Blanca, though, assumed the bigger burden of the family business because she was freer. She didn't have children like Regina had, and she might have had better disposition to do it as well. At any rate, Blanca's money lending is associated to her status as a widow, and it moved towards two interlinked objectives, I think. One is the protection of her grandchildren inheritance and the family assets, and the second would be the recovery of her dowry in view to remarry. And indeed, sometime soon after 1351, she was remarried to Benveniste Samuel, who was another member of the elite of the Jewish quarter in Barcelona, and he was also a money lender. And shortly after, Blanca disappears from public life. Nonetheless, and even with these restrictions and limitations in time, Blanca played a very important role in the consolidation of her first husband's family assets. And it seems that her second marriage worked towards that as well and reinforced the network of connections that the Garcia family had in the Jewish quarter. And Blanca's grandson, when he comes into the business after 1361, appears acting with Blanca's second husband in economic transactions. At that point, 1361, Blanca figures in the documents as quondam, so she had died already. That's my first example. The second one is a different one. It's Bonafilla, who appears in documents related to the manufacture of bales of silk, which is one of the professional specialties of the Jews of Barcelona. This is a woman who works with her hands. It's not a financial activity like money lending. She acted together with her husband Isaac Nathan in 1351 in the purchase of silk from a Christian exchange broker. And 17 years later, she's still active, and she agreed to an association with her husband and with a merchant and investor in silk called Salomó de Manresa. In the document, which is very interesting, the three individuals were named as bale weavers. So she is categorized professionally, and Isaac and Bonafilla consented to make veils with silk and weave with thread of gold. It looks like they have quite a lot of skill within the manufacture, and the responsibilities in working of the three of them are very clear. But when it comes to the clauses about dividing the benefits of the association, these mention only the two men, and Bonafilla is not anywhere to be seen. So that shows the inequality of Bonafilla's position in the sharing of the benefits of the business. The case is quite unique because there are not other examples that I have found of acknowledgement of Jewish women as artisans in the documents. However, we can assume that there were more women that were active in textile work, particularly in tasks that could be carried out at home. And even if this went usually unacknowledged, this is happening also among Christians. So it's not that unusual that they do more work that is actually documented. The fact is that Christian women enjoyed a higher level of recognition in professional categories anyway, and they could even become masters of heads of workshops. In Barcelona, they never seem to reach the preeminence that they have in the silk industries of Paris, in Rouen, or in Cologne, but they have certainly a higher documental presence than Jewish women. We have even a Christian woman, Romia Valeria, who engaged male Jewish bale weavers to work for her. So Christian women had apparently more easier access to professional status. And this seems to be demonstrated by the fact that after 1391, there is a number of conversas that appear in the manufacture of veils in Barcelona. And this might be an evidence of changes in the status of the Jewish women after conversions that allow them a greater level of participation in public life. It could also be an indication of the growth of the profession linked to processes of demand and trade, and that promoted the increase of workers. and that favored the professional recognition of these women until their new religious identities. So this is something for discussion. The third and last example that I want to propose is Goch. She was the wife of Isaac Ferrer Joseph, a master of coral. He was an artisan and a trader in coral, and coral was the main manufacturer of the Jews of Barcelona in the late 14th century. The couple appeared in 1383, borrowing money from Christians under the form of sales of perpetual rents. Probably this was to support investments in maritime trade in Levant. As you can see, there are some commendas that Isaac was involved in, and presumably also to invest in their own trade and manufacture in coral. In 1387, we can see Isaac traveling between Barcelona and Alghero, purchasing coral precisely. Goch appears in the last document in the list, which is a purchase of coral jointly with her husband, and in it she resounds to the legal protection of her assets under the Senatus Consultus Velellanos, which is a usual form. With this, she effectively allowed for her dowry to be used to pay debts in case of her husband's insolvency. And this is very interesting because it's a clause in Roman law, and it relates to ideas of Jewish acculturation and navigation of diverse legal systems that are acknowledged in the historiography of the Jewish communities in the Mediterranean, and particularly in Catalonia. We might wonder if Goch was something more than a collateral. Maybe she was a silent partner, or maybe she even helped to administer and manage the business. That would not be surprising, as the wives of Christian coral merchants in Marseille, for example, run their workshops in absence of their husbands and supervise the staff. But we cannot know this, and the documents are not forthcoming about what she did or not. But just as in the case of the silk weaving, the work of women in the manufacture of coral became acknowledged after the Conversas of 1391, with contracts extended to Christians and to Christian women and Conversas. And this confirms what we saw with the former case, that it was easier to access professional status for Christian than for Jewish women in Barcelona somehow. So to conclude, these examples pose many questions, but in some it seems that it's clear that there are specific reasons for the limited evidence of the access of Jewish women to business in their own name or with professional standing. And these reasons can be linked to cultural perceptions, like the fact that only widows are able to manage family finances and practice money lending, while married women like Bonafilla and Goch remain in the shadow of their husband, even if they have a professional status, or they allow the development of a family business with their own assets, so they are in the shadow. These cultural restrictions seem to change after the mass conversions of Jews in 1391, when more female workers, more conversas start to appear or become more visible in what had been the traditionally main industries of the Jews of Barcelona. And these changes in volume of women as professionals correspond also to specific economic dynamics that, for cases like Blanca, impose the incorporation of Jewish widows in the credit market. And this goes beyond the dynamics of the Jewish quarter. It goes into the dynamics of Barcelona and Catalonia in general. So after the Black Death, the need of capital, the lack of money lenders moves women into the business. For artisan women, it seems that the growth of traditional Jewish professionals due to demand of trade might have favored the integration, their integration in the workforce, including Christian and Jewish. And these are the questions that I'm working on at the present, and I'm hoping that people will ask a lot of things and suggest a lot of ideas to continue with it. And I'll finish here. Thank you for listening.
Excellent, thank you, Anna. And now we'll move on to the presentation by Alexandra and Dana.
Thank you so much, Antonella. Everyone can hear me okay? Yes? Do I have a thumbs up there? Okay. Thanks for joining us today, and thank you for the organizers for inviting us. As Antonella mentioned, this is work that Dana and I do collaboratively. from the research to the writing. We do it all together, and we're happy to talk about that process in the Q&A period. But for the sake of time, let's jump right into it. So on August 21st of 1396, Constanza, the wife of the venerable Pere de Richard, citizen of Girona, hired Bonsignor Samuel, a local Jew, to sell an enslaved Tatar woman named Joanna. The contract of procuratorship noted that the sale was approved by Constanza's husband, Pere. 4 years later, on August 6th of 1400, Pere himself acted as procurator for Constanza, confirming a debt owed to her in the amount of 8 florins by a Christian man from a nearby village. The debtor, also named Pere, of course, promised to fulfill his obligation by September 1st of that year. Notarial records from the city of Girona in the late 14th and early 15th century have many examples of Constanza using Christian, Jewish, and converser procurators to act on her behalf in a variety of situations. We also have numerous documents where Constanza concluded these contracts herself, both when her husband was alive and after she was widowed. In June of 1403, for example, Constanza received a payment of 20 sous from Joan Sunier of Rio de Lotes de la Selva. And this payment was made annually and related to assets that Constanza had inherited from her father. It is one of many credit relationships that Constanza managed. Now, Constanza herself had been born a Jew called Belaira, the daughter of Astruc Lobel Gracia and his wife Astruga. When a wave of violence that had engulfed Jewish communities across Castile and the Crown of Aragon hit Girona in August of 1391, Belaira converted to Christianity and took the name Constanza. Her husband at the time, Isaac Reven, did not convert, and the couple split up. I don't know exactly the dates from when they separated here, but by February of 1393, Constanza was remarried to the Christian Pere de Richard, described as venerable in the notarial records involving him. It is possible that Pere was an old Christian. We don't have any reference to him as being converso, for example. And the fact that he's always described as venerable and a citizen of Girona leads us to believe that he wasn't a recent convert like Constanza. That Constanza appears in the notarial records often is not entirely surprising, considering she inherited much property from both her parents and had the use and management of the property of her late husband, Pere de Richard, when he died sometime around 1406. As a conversa, Constanza remained in between cultures. Many of those who converted in the context of the anti-Jewish violence of 1391 remained closely connected to their Jewish friends and family members, often marrying other conversos and continued to live the same life they had before as Jews. Yet others attempted to assimilate into Christian culture, getting involved in Christian institutions and marrying old Christians. Either way, our research of this first generation in Girona shows that conversos would sometimes follow Jewish practices, sometimes Christian practices, depending on what was most advantageous to them. For conversos like Constanza, such pragmatic choices could have been made to protect their assets and those of their families during a time when they faced numerous challenges because of the changing religious and demographic landscape.
Much of our evidence from the notarial archives in Girona reflect Constanza's status as a wealthy married woman and then a widow, but her path to heiress was fraught with challenges, particularly as a result of her conversion in 1391. A notarial contract from the 28th of November, 1391, details Constanza's conflict with her first husband, Isaac Revin, over the return of her dotal assets. Working with a converso procurator, Pere Benet de Recherche, not to be confused with her husband, Pere de Recherche, Constanza attempted to compel Isaac to return these assets as she wished to dissolve their marriage because of her conversion. Isaac had publicly stated that he had no desire to convert to Christianity as his wife had. He also did not want to return her dowry and insisted that her conversion was not grounds for dowry restitution, as their marriage was contracted within Judaism. On the 15th of December, 1391, Constanza obtained a letter from Queen Violante supporting her position that she should be compensated, and ordering her officials to seize Isaac's property and support Constanza from it until her dowry was fully restored. Now, at this point, it remains unclear to us whether Constanza did get her dowry back. We do know that in 1394, her mother, Astruga, who remained Jewish, gave her 10,000 sous for Constanza to use as a dowry in her second marriage. Now, the battle with Isaac over control of Constanza's dowry was not the first time she and her first husband had been in conflict. In 1380, Constanza's father, Astruclo Belgracia, went to court to force Isaac to fulfill promises he had made to Constanza, then Belaye, when they married. Among these promises was to allow Belaye to stay in Girona for at least 3 years instead of moving to Castillo de Empúries, where he had recently located. It may well be that for Constanza, conversion was a way out of a difficult marriage. Now, Constanza had inherited a substantial amount of property from her parents, who remained Jewish after the violence of 1391. Her father was one of the leaders of the Jewish community, being a fixed member of its council since 1354, and serving in various positions in Alhama administration over the years. He is listed as one of the secretaries of the Alhama who sought refuge in the Gironella Tower in that fateful August of 1391, and seems to have survived the attacks. When he died, probably in 1393, Constanza appears to have been his universal heir, and her mother Astruga also held control over aspects of his estate. Astruga herself was deceased by 1399, with Constanza as her universal heir. Notarial documents from March of that year show Constanza collecting payments for loans that had originally been extended by her mother. As Constanza's position as heiress for her parents demonstrates, her conversion did not break ties to her natal family. Instead, the evidence clearly indicates her continued relationship with them, even as her marriage to Isaac faltered and was dissolved.
The wealth that Constanza inherited from her parents largely consisted of hundreds of loan contracts and credit notes. In her management of these assets over the next 30 years, she made judicious use of networks in the Christian, Converso, and Jewish communities of Girona. Thus far, we have found 85 notarial contracts related to credit that involve Constanza from 1393 to 1422. These documents present Constanza in various roles as an actor in the credit market in Girona, as lender of short-term loans, as recipient of payments for annuities, as buyer and seller of credit notes. Her clients range from prominent Christian men who were noted as citizens of Girona, Christian couples who lived in one of the villages surrounding the city, conversos from wealthy Jewish families, to the secretaries of the Alhama itself. One aspect that our analysis of these credit instruments illustrates is the growth of her presence as an actor on her own behalf after her widowhood in 1406. While she appears on her own as a married woman in 13 contracts, as a widow, she acts herself in 40 of them. Although Jewish sages argue that women should preserve their privacy and modesty at all times, of course, Jewish women throughout the medieval world played an active role in the economic life of their families. Among these women, widows were particularly active, and in this sense, Jewish women were not different from their Christian neighbors. Christian widows both continued their deceased husband economic activities in some cases, but also engaged in their own forms of work and asset management. They could also be named tutors for their children and managers of their inherited property. Much like Jewish widows, therefore, Christian widows were seen as more than capable of continuing their economic activities to the benefit of the family. As a conversa who straddled Christian and Jewish worlds, Constanza's actions as a businesswoman and manager of familial assets were therefore accepted. The recognition that both Christian and Jewish widows were capable managers of family assets extends to their appointment of procurators to act legally on their behalf. Procuratorships were recognized in Jewish law since ancient times due to the importance of commerce in Jewish society. It is worth pointing out that Jewish law prohibited the appointment of a procurator who was not Jewish in order to perform a legal act such as buying and selling. The contracts we deal with in this paper, however, were concluded under Roman civil law since they were drafted by Christian notaries.
In the 85 credit contracts involving Constanza, she used a procurator in 32 instances. And those who acted as her legal agents included her husband Pere, a Christian man, a Jew who had served as secretary of the Alhama, and that Jew's wife. In the other 53 contracts, Constanza acted on her own behalf. Now, following Constanza through the notarial records has allowed us to link several series of documents that are connected to individual loans, which highlights her use of different types of procurators. One of the assets she inherited from her mother, Astruga, was a violare or lifetime annuity, which Astruga had purchased from Montserrat Plan. A series of documents from 1400 to 1420 show Plan making annual payments to Constanza for this annuity. Up until his death in 1406, her husband Pere received these payments most of the time. But after that point, we see other Christians, but also Constanza herself as the recipient in these contracts. Constanza's use of procurators in the management of her assets highlights how relationships with specific kin groups could develop into business partnerships, as well as support for one another in credit transactions, both before and after conversion. Throughout her adult life, Constanza made use of Bonseñor Samuel, a Jew of Girona, as her procurator, increasingly so after her husband Pere died. Some of these instances involved business related to Constanza's own property, but others were related to assets she held in common with Bonseñor. Her connections with his family remained after Bonseñor's death in 1410, as the assets they held together were inherited by his two sons, Reuven and Vidal, as well as his wife Bonavia. Reuven converted to Christianity in 1416 and Vidal in the 1420s. And at various points, Constanza acted as procurator for them as they managed the property they had inherited from their father. And we've only briefly touched on Constanza's relationship with Christians, Jews, and Conversos, but we should emphasize that over her lifetime, the situation in Girona changed a great deal. In the 1390s, some women converted, but the largest waves of conversion would follow in the 1410s, particularly after the disputation of Tortosa. Many of the wealthiest and most influential Jews of the community would convert then, but not necessarily their wives and children, creating new kinds of challenges as the Converso community came under increasing pressure from municipal and ecclesiastical authorities over their continued relationships with their Jewish relatives and spouses. Unfortunately, we are keenly aware of the time and we want to leave room for discussion. But if you're interested, we recommend the article we published last year in the Journal of Medieval Iberian Studies, which focuses on two women named Torana. In many ways, Constanza Rejarch is a unique example to consider the economic agency of Conversas in the decades after the violence of 1391. She came from a wealthy and powerful family and had access to enormous resources that other women did not. And part of the reason why we're able to talk about her in depth is because there is so much extant evidence of her activity in her lifetime. We discussed the 85 credit contracts featuring Constanza, but there are dozens of other notarial records related to various aspects of her life, including her disputes with her first husband and the marriage contract with her second husband. At the same time, however, Constanza's role as a woman active in the credit market of late medieval Girona was not unusual for Jewish women or conversas, either married or widowed. Our exploration of the notarial records in Girona from 1391 to 1425 has uncovered hundreds of credit contracts where women are lending small amounts of money as one means of supporting themselves and their families. Our work and those of our colleagues in this session has shown that whatever patriarchal paradigms Christian, Jewish, or Conversa women lived under, the reality on the ground was much more nuanced. It highlights that such women had economic agency and contributed to the economic dynamism of their communities. Thank you.
Thank you both for your fantastic presentation. And last but not least, Mireia.
Yes, I do have a, well, thank you for inviting me to this webinar. I join in the thanks of my colleagues. It's a pleasure to share this roundtable with them and with all of you. I will focus my paper mostly on widowhood and especially on spinning workshops. A factor that determined the economic welfare of widows was having a proper job or the possibility of continuing the family business, sometimes on their own, sometimes as a transitional link between their husbands and sons, if guild statutes did not specifically forbid it. If they had a job of their own, the death of the husband did not disturb their work status, although it affected their economic situation, for the husband's death often meant losing the main source of income to support the family, and thus the loss of material resources. The jobs that women used to perform were mostly related to the supply of the household, spinning, clothing, and food production, retail, and so on. These activities often demanded less qualified workers and were usually on the margins of the market economy. However, both married women and widows engaged in other kinds of activities that departed from the traditional female roles established by patriarchal social conventions. Some of them took up occupations that were a little more prestigious and yielded greater profits, like Rumia, a silk master, Sancha Ximénez de Cabrera, a textile businesswoman, Caterina Llull, a merchant, or Isabel, the widow of Jenny Solsona, an apothecary. Actually, I would like to talk specifically about the aforementioned Sancha Ximénez de Cabrera. She was born in 1393 into a family of high nobility. She was the daughter of Timbó de Prades and Bernat IV, Viscount of Cabrera and Bas, and Count of Modica. She was married by proxy in the middle of the Sardinian campaign in 1408 to Arcambal de Foix, Lord of Novallas. Her husband was assassinated in 1419, together with the Duke of Burgundy, when they were on their way to negotiate the truce with the future Charles VII of France. This fact had terrible political consequences, but also severe personal consequences for Sancha Ximénez, who remained widowed with two young daughters, Isabel and Joanna. She was for many years of her long life an active widow. She had to plead to recover her dowry, which she never fully recovered, and to recuperate her daughters, who remained in the hands of her brother-in-law. We document her living in Barcelona in 1431, when she was given the chapel of Saints Clara and Catherine, the Cathedral of Barcelona, for 300 florins. Here in the slide, you can see the chapel where she was buried. Before discussing her economic activity, it is important to point out that Sancha was first and foremost a feudal lady. From 1439, she held the venal lordship of the Valley of Usó. Here you can see Barcelona, and Usó is more or less here. The Valley of Usó in Girona. She had under her dominion 63 farmhouses and a mine. She used to travel to her manor to collect the rent and administer justice. However, these rights were seized by the peasant leader Francesc de Verntallar in collusion with King John II, despite the fact that her family, the Cabrera family, supported the royalist side during the Catalan Civil War, which lasted from 1462 to 1472. In the archives of Barcelona Cathedral, several of Sancha's account books have been preserved, which show the direct control she exercised over her finances. Reading her account books, together with some letters referring to the administration of her manor, allow us to discover her professional activity. A careful reading of the documentation leads us to the conclusion that she managed, in addition to the fifth, a spinning workshop at her house in Barcelona. She received carded hemp yarn, cleaned and prepared by the peasant women of Usó under the supervision of a woman from the petty nobility. Spinning was an unregulated work throughout the Middle Ages, but in the 15th century it came under the control of the Guild of Weavers, which imposed various conditions on the spinners. Obviously, the spinners had no representation, no privilege or authority in the guild. Spinners worked under different labor regimes. Some of them were owners of workshops, so they bought the raw material, produced the yarn, bleached it, and sold it directly in the Plaza de la Llana, the wool market. And some of them had apprentices to whom they taught the trade. Others worked at home and on behalf of textile merchants that supplied them with the carded wool, which had been previously cleaned and carded by peasants in the rural areas where the raw material came from, as in the case of Sansa. So the production and the first tasks were carried out in Uzo. Then Sansa Ximenes, with some collaborators, a group of 5 or 6 women, spun the yarn. Sansa Ximenes weighed the thread before and after bleaching. And after the bleaching process, she sent the threads to be woven, especially to professional women. Then with the fabric, they made veils in her home workshop in Santana Square. Her account books allow us to know all this process. They all spun together, and Sansa wrote down in her account book the skeins that each of them had spun. And also she recorded that she spun, writing in her own handwriting, spun by me, Sansa Ximenes. Some of these products were for their own consumption, but part of the yarn was sold to weavers. When Sansa moved to her domains, she did not stop her professional activity. She traveled with her companions, the spindles, and the account book, in which she wrote down the threads they spun and their deliveries to the weavers in Barcelona. Little is known about the last year of her life. Sansa Ximenes made her will on the 1st February 1471. Yes. Her administrator, a clergyman from Uzo called Joan Font de Borrell, wrote down in his account book that on this 17th of July 1472, Sansa Ximenes fell seriously ill. She remained bedridden until her death on the 25th November of 1474. She was buried in Barcelona Cathedral, in the chapel she had founded. She died very old and almost ruined. She appointed the hospital and the Philharmonic of Barcelona, a cathedral charity institution, as her heirs. She bequeathed her furniture to institutions and people she trusted, except for that furniture bearing her coat of arms, which she ordered to burn. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mireia, and thanks to all our speakers. Just a reminder for our attendees, please do put your questions in the Q&A chat that you can see at the bottom of your screen. There's an icon. Please include your questions there. It will be easier for us to track what has been answered or not, or has to be answered easier than if you put those questions in the chat. So I think we have already a few questions in the chat. So a couple of questions for Anna. One is about, both are actually about, well, on the one hand, the silk that you were talking about for one of your case studies. The question is, to what extent, what do we know about the use of silk? In other words, who was meant to get this silk? Is it meant for anything other than the consumption of the wealthy and the elite? Do we know anything about where does the silk end up? And there's another question also for Anna from Simon in the chat that is about telling us a little bit more about the coral manufacturing industry and whether we know anything about where this coral came from, etc.
Yes, thank you for the questions. So yeah, the first question, so the silk, it doesn't look like, because at least this silk that is manufactured by Jewish people in Barcelona is destined basically to make veils as headdresses. So there's very little definition about how they look like, but I think the impression that we get is that it's, even though silk is a luxury item, these veils are quite modest. So it's not like when we have references like Romia that also Mireia mentioned. This lady, for example, she makes cordons of silk and passementerie things that are more luxury items. These veils don't seem to, although some of them have gold thread waved into them. But often these veils are also made with a mixture of silk and cotton. So I think that they are basically to do wimple kind of headdress. And some of them can be more ornated, but it looks like this is a mass-produced kind of object that is not too complicated. Some of the veils are sold to the royal house, but they are sold in like bulk by some Jewish traders and silk weavers. So that adds to the idea that they are actually for the ladies of the household or for like everyday use, because there are so many. So that is not for this kind of silk. What I think is that more specialized and more luxurious silk is waved somewhere else, as imported from Italy, from Montpellier probably, from even Andalusia, Granada, etc., as already manufactured kind of cloth of silk that might be then transformed in Barcelona, but not by Jews in the Jewish quarter necessarily, and not in the amount that we find these products. Okay. So for the second question, the coral, really interesting. Yeah, coral has been a constant in the Mediterranean since earlier times, but it doesn't really come to be a product that you see in such frequency until the late 14th century. There is a clear association between the access to the coral reefs of Alghero in Sardinia from 1354, basically, when the population of Alghero is installed as Catalan, is made Catalan and controlled by Catalan merchants. There is a presence of Marseille as well in Sardinia since earlier times. But there are news about commerce and trade of coral, but manufacture in Barcelona is not really that well known until this period that I'm working on after the Black Death, and then it's in hands of Jews. The manufacture is earlier, the trade is earlier and is in hands of Christians as well as Jews, but the manufacture is specifically Jewish. There is a very interesting research carried out for Marseille as well on that by Juliette Sibon, and she works on these ideas on whether it's a monopoly or not. It's been said by several authors that it's a monopoly of Jews. I struggle with the word monopoly because the investment and the input of Christian merchants is very big. So I wouldn't say that it's exclusive to Jews, although I don't find in the sources artisans in coral. The production is destined to export, and it's exported to Islamic countries, which is very interesting, and to the north of Europe. The Marseille production seems to be associated to the manufacture of rosaries and paternosters that are sold to the court of Avignon, the Pope's court of Avignon. Catalan Jews make a lot of paternosters and buttons for as pieces of luxury, for costumes, for dresses. So it is a very interesting thing. The impression is that, and this is not me only saying it, it's Claude Carrère and Damien Coulon have worked on these ideas on coral as being an industry that is pushed by the Christian merchants in Barcelona, actually, and they find workforce in the Jewish quarter easily. Does that answer your question?
Thank you, Anna. Fantastic. Actually, I think there's a question from Mireia.
I just want to add something about the choral, because we know that women work also the choral, and they had to pass an exam like men. So I think it's important today to say this, that women work choral items that like buttons and paternosters, and they had to pass exam like men.
Yes, adding to that, though, my information, and perhaps we can talk about that later, is that this only happens after the mass conversions, because the choral guild is not created until the 1390s, isn't it? And before that, as I said, I don't find women manually working choral, although immediately after the conversions, there start to appear as apprenticeships of women conversas into the work of choral. So that's also very interesting. Thank you, Mireia.
Thank you. There's also another question in the chat. This time is for Dana and Alexandra, and because obviously focusing on your case study on Costanza, the question is, do you think, or is there anything that we can say about conversion to Christianity having anything to do with her attempt to go up the social ladder, let's say?
Well, it's very hard for us to be able to say anything definite about their intentions when they converted, right? Because we don't have the kind of documentation that will get us into that. One thing we can say, though, is conversion doesn't guarantee any sort of upward trajectory necessarily, right? And other folks that have done research before 1391, so for example, Paula Tartakov looked at women's conversion, Jewish women's conversion before 1391, and found that often it was a very sort of risky move for them in terms of many had struggled with poverty and were cut off by their families and so forth and so on. Now it can be a strategy as well, economic strategy, in the sense of, if the Jewish community is being in a tough fiscal crisis, as they were in Girona at this point, conversion is a way out of that fiscal situation. I mean, Jewish communities had to contribute a certain amount of taxes to the royal treasury as a community, independently of how many people were part of it, right? So the Girona community was supposed to contribute a certain amount of money, but the reality post 1391 is that community was shrinking, was smaller and smaller. So that means that the weight per person was increasing, right? So there was a lot of tension about that, a lot of pleads to the queen, which was the person that was in charge of that particular Jewish community. So that can be economic strategies as well. In the case of Constanza specifically, we can't really say, other than the fact that she was in conflict with her husband often before. And conversion did allow her then to end that marriage. And she remarried almost right away to this Père de Recharge. So I assume then that they knew each other before, and there was some connection there. It's hard for us to say, but she married very quickly after 1391. I don't know if Dana wants to add anything.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for us to know because her conversion happens in the context of this violence, right? So we don't know if she's one of the people that's attacked and dragged to the cathedral to be baptized, or whether she decides, because she's in this, locked up in this tower in terrible conditions, that conversion is a better way forward. As well, her Jewish family was extremely wealthy and very powerful. And so upward mobility would be upward mobility in terms of a change in religious faith, but not in terms of economic status, because she was already at the top with her family.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So I don't know if there are any other questions from the audience. If so, please do write them down in the Q&A box. If not, I've got a question. Well, I've got a series of questions. But there's one, I guess I could start from Mireia, but it's a question that it's open to everyone. And it is, since I read actually your biography, that the age thing got me thinking. And so I was wondering to what extent, because we've been discussing obviously the role of these women in different series of economic activities, but especially in these networks that all of you have kind of discussed and talked about. We know that trust is a big topic, but it's also one of those major links. And so I do wonder to what extent the age of these women that might relate to their experience, etc., also plays a role, and whether this is something at all that emerges from your sources.
Well, in fact, Sancha died when she was more or less 80 years old, but we don't really know anything about her last days, because she had problems with her fiefs, because she was seized by the during the Civil War. But I think that the most important thing is that she was a widow. So she was able to manage her properties and to manage her workshop without by her own. So I think this is the main reason. But also she's a noble woman, so I think this is another important thing. And I think also that she was a literate woman, so she knows how to manage her properties. We have, I think, 4 account books. When she wrote down a lot of things, she had administrators, but also she wrote by her own. So we know her activity, thank you to these account books and her letters. And I think she also was a woman with I don't know how to say in English, with a hard, Anna, help me, un carácter fort.
A strong personality.
Thank you, a strong personality. And so I think we cannot focus on only on one thing, because it depends on a lot of things. But I think that widowhood is an important thing to have in mind.
Thanks, Mireia. Before we continue, I think it's time to wrap up this session for at least the Facebook side of it, which is the live side that finishes in like a minute or so. However, if any of our attendees would like to remain with us for a little bit longer, then we can answer, because I can see there are a few more questions in the chat if our speakers are also happy to stay for a few more minutes. So I think Miriam would like to say something to conclude this session.
Thank you, Antonella. I basically just want to draw the live session to a close because our technician who's facilitating this very kindly agrees to stay on until 7, but she has to go home to London now. So we're wrapping up the live session. I very quickly wanted to thank the chair, as always, Antonella, very professional, and our amazing speakers, and also the audience for their amazing questions and for being there for us and with us at the webinar series. Our next webinar will take place on the 18th of January, and the topic will be the 2 sides of war economy, mobilization and allocation of resources in the medieval Mediterranean, 1100 to 1500. So we're saying goodbye to the live audience now. The webinar audience can stay here if you want to hear us chat for another few minutes, but we're saying goodbye to the live audience. Bye-bye, stay safe, and see you soon.